Hey guys, you're watching Let's Talk About Prepping. I'm Tyler, your host, and in this video, we're just having a little bit of a really late night chat. Gonna have a little bit of a drink. Got some cider going here. Just going to briefly chat about living off grid. Curious how many preppers would truly be able to change their lifestyle to an off-grid lifestyle without catastrophic changes to their lifestyle, just based on the idea of going off grid. There are a lot of changes involved in living that way, and a lot of people's lifestyles are not conducive to doing that. But I do see prepping as something where one of the ultimate goals of it is to live a sustainable off-grid lifestyle. And I do feel that that's one of the best ways to be a prepper, to be a survivalist, to be a sustainable living person, is to eventually live in such a way that you are as unreliant upon other people on the grid as possible. So before we get going, just say a happy 4th of July to everybody out there. It's a pretty nice Independence Day so far. It's only been going for about a half hour here, but shaping up pretty nicely. I would argue that cider's quite an American drink, including hard cider. People have been drinking hard cider for a while, but apples didn't used to be like they are now. The French word for apple literally is the potato of the tree. So if you think of a potato or as an apple without any sugar, it really is somewhat like a potato that just grows on a tree, just sort of a starchy plant fruit, around the time that America was really growing as colonies and as its own place, it became really popular to cultivate different types of apple. And in the early days of America, it was very common for people to cultivate just different kinds on their own family farms. And that's where people started really breeding sweet apples, to where they had something that was sugary and that tasted like what we know today. A lot of the flavors or strains of apples that we know today that we purchased that are flavorful were basically not in existence a few hundred years ago. So while people did, press apples, the apples did have sugars. They weren't the same sugars that cut our tongue the same way, if you will. So the ciders themselves were often sort of just a very dry, bitterish drink. And one of the main benefits of them was the fermenting process killing germs. So, because a lot of people drank fermented drinks like beer or ciders or things like that, because the water itself could get you sick. So a lot of people did just generally drink a cider or something like that. Now, the alcohol content often wasn't nearly as high because the sugar content wasn't nearly as high. But so, it's quite a different thing than it used to be. But I do believe that cider, even sweet, sugary ciders as we have today, are a pretty American thing. They're traditionally common in a lot of different cultures, but I think that bourbon and cider make for a pretty good combo on the 4th of July. Everybody's either sleeping or busy, it would seem. 5 minutes in, no live stream audience, which is just fine. I actually don't want to be on here too late. So the topic is whether or not preppers could be off-grid homesteaders. Now, I know that it's the ultimate goal for a lot of us, but a lot of us really had such a lifestyle that it would be very difficult to get our family, everybody in our ideal prepper group together living off of grid. It's sort of a pipe dream fantasy for a lot of people. Having done it a couple times, enough to at least sink my teeth into it and know what it's like, and be doing it for long enough to pass through some of the challenges, I can say that it takes a lot of sacrifice, it takes a lot of hard work, and it takes a lot of being willing to change and adapt your lifestyle and sacrifice parts of your lifestyle in order to make it work. It's definitely something that a lot of people simply have no desire to do, and even among those who have the desire to do it, it's one of those things which has a very steep learning curve among people today. Even a couple hundred years ago, people had the opportunity to just move to the city. You know, cities existed, and you could go and live in somewhere that there were what back then stood as modern conveniences. So you didn't always have to be a homestead, person. It is definitely a harder lifestyle than the city or village lifestyle. So I do think that in a lot of different situations, it's sort of a filter that you can hold up against yourself and your lifestyle. You can look at people who live off the grid now and really ask yourself if you would be able to do that, if you'd be able to get your family to do that, short of a major catastrophic event. And I think that that's sort of a good standard to hold your preps up against, because if you're not ready to do that, it sort of gives you a good perspective on how much hardship you're in for if the grid does go down. So I think that's why a lot of people end up wanting to live that way, because you can't really know how ready you are to live without the grid until you're starting to do it now. And once you start doing it, you begin to realize just how many ways we rely on the grid and on inputs from the outside world. And you begin to realize just how long it takes to actually find all of those challenges and overcome them in such a way that you don't just continue to rely on inputs from the outside world. Because whether they want to admit it, the vast majority of preppers, the vast majority of sustainable off-grid living people, they still require inputs of some kind. It's just nearly impossible to live where you don't rely on anybody else whatsoever. It almost never has been. And while technology and resources of today's modern society do allow you to make great strides forward compared to what other people were ever able to do in the past, there still are limitations on how much food you can produce and how much work you can do in a day, even with all of the automated conveniences available to a person today. You can just only harvest so many acres on your own. So while you can augment a homesteader off-grid lifestyle to a certain degree, for instance, I've lived places where you simply had to ladle the water out of a hot pot of water to take a shower. Other times there are much more convenient systems like solar pumps and stuff like that. So there are a lot of different ways that you can live. And part of this thought process here was inspired by a comment chain, one of my last videos, between myself, Prepper's Daughter, and Mosaic Master. Prepper's Daughter was saying that she thinks one of the best ways to prepare yourself for almost any situation is to simply live like you're in the 1800s. And Mosaic Master said that you would still want electricity and a lot of modern conveniences, that those things are pretty much necessary to truly thrive. And his perspective was from having seen people go without just basic modern conveniences, which basically are, necessary for humans to have a thriving modern lifestyle. It's not just a convenience, it's a source of energy. It's a resource that allows a person to rise up out of just having no ability to do things. It's definitely something that we take for granted. Um, but I don't necessarily think, and this is the conversation that we ended up having, that just wanting to live off grid or just wanting to live like you're in the 1800s is about just eschewing technology, electricity, or all these things. I think we all agree that a homesteader or a person living sort of on the edge of their means back in the 1800s would love to have electricity and pumps and farm equipment and all kinds of things from these days, but that they very likely would not necessarily just abandon their lifestyle, thinking that they no longer need to have a large pantry or do the things that they do. I like to think that a lot of people who truly appreciate the meaning of their lifestyle back then would simply augment it using modern conveniences. And I think that that's a very good way to look at things nowadays. A lot of people who go off grid just sort of have this idea that if they go off of the grid, if they're not living using grid energy, if they don't have plumbing that goes to the sewage grid, they're doing what it takes to be ready to live without the grid if it goes down. But they're still going to the store every single day. They're still relying on, hey, Anna, how you doing? I wondered if I would see you, but it's got to be about 4 a.m. over there. So we're sort of just chatting about whether or not people, asking if people would be able to go off grid. It takes a lot, and a lot of people, insomnia strikes. Yep, I understand what that's like. So it takes a lot to go off grid, and I'm sure that at least part of your family would love to do that. And a lot of people in the prepping community sort of see that as the ultimate goal. Hey, Prescott, how you doing? What are you up to tonight? You're in my time zone. Right on, man. I got some local hard cider here. Can't have a drink, but we can have a drink. Right on. I'm generally not a beer person, but my new job, I need to start being able to make recommendations and share my opinion on beers and wines and different things like that. So I have to expand my horizons a little bit. So we're just chatting a little bit about living off grid and how difficult it is, and how probably a lot of people aren't as ready for it as they would like to think. I've actually often thought that it would be really cool to open a sort of prepper off-grid training ranch where people in the community could come and get like a crash course in what it's like to live off a grid, and all of the things that you have to do throughout the day in order to have your next day go successfully. That's the basis of when people say living like you're in the 1800s or something like that. It's not just abandoning technology and going and living using wooden tools and stuff like that. It's about understanding how much work it takes to live when you can't just simply use dollars to take care of things. We have done a whole lot in the past 100 years to make it easy for a person to live and simply purchase the things that it needs to live each day quickly. For instance, back in the 1800s, it was just much more common to have to spend a lot more time getting your water or preparing your food or just doing various tasks that we take for granted nowadays. For instance, the majority of us do our laundry by having a machine do it while we perform other tasks. Nobody in our family has to spend at least an hour doing our laundry. We simply have to keep our laundry working in the background. So just simple tasks like that we allot only a certain amount of time out of our day take more time, even just for an off-grid person, because they at least have to fire up the generator and set up the gravity feed hose and just the various things that are involved. Or they will have had to have done that sometime in the past week. But you can see that it's not nearly as easy as living on the grid where it's just a simple turn of the hose. Now, obviously, the ideal sustained lifestyle is living off of some kind of highly gravity fed, spring fed system or some such thing. But until you have that set up, until you have, really put either the money or the time into getting all of those things, I think it's important to appreciate what it's like to simply walk into the woods and try to start a raw off-grid lifestyle, because that's what it's going to be like for the majority of preppers if they don't have it before this all starts. Now, I do have experience with walking into the woods, picking a raw piece of land, and trying to develop it mostly by hand. I have done that in the past. I was pretty much too poor to really do it with equipment or the proper way, but determined to get started. And I can tell you that it's not at all something that you want to do in an emergency situation. If you need to be living off the grid, that is not the time to be cutting the land and putting your things in. So aside from all of that, as I was saying before anybody joined in, I think it's just a good comparison, a good bar to hold yourself up to hold your preps up to, even if it's not a direct goal for you to live off grid or to be a sustainable living homesteader, to ask yourself, if you could go off grid, what challenges would you face? Would it be your children? Would it be your partner? Would it be your job, your debt? Would it be the time in your day that you don't have to do all the things that would be necessary when living off grid? Would it be physical energy? There is just a lot that goes into living that way. It's not the kind of thing where you can just stumble home drunk all the time and not take care of things before you go to bed or wake up early and do a lot of things. So there are just a lot of differences. And I think that a lot of people take for granted the idea that it's just a different kind of house that you live in. You can get it that way, but you have to invest a lot of money in it. And for most people, the reality of going off grid is that you have to do it on as much of a budget as you can, and you have to put as much of your own back work into it as you can. And that's just really a bottleneck that I think will filter out a lot of people. It's a challenge for myself, the times that I've done it. Turn the power off for a weekend. Yeah, but it's just different from that, For instance, when I lived off grid, when I was trying to start my own personal off grid place, I was hauling water in my truck from town, and in two big blue 55 or 65 gallon drums. Now, even then, I wasn't nearly off grid. My water wasn't coming from a spring source or anything that would still be around if the grid was down, but I was making the steps towards that. But even so, almost every single day or every other day, I had to go to a source of water, whether that was the fairgrounds downtown or a family house, and fill my drums up so that we had water out at the off-grid property. And when we got there, I had to set my truck up so that that would gravity feed into my gravity system. So almost every single day there was at least that chore, not to mention the various other chores that I had to take care of before I went to bed at the end of the night. Um, so it's just very different from how I live nowadays, where I can, if I choose to, pretty much just get home and crash if I just want to get up early the next day. And that's really something that I couldn't do back then, and it's something that you wouldn't really be able to do in most off-grid lifestyles. You can't just walk into the bathroom, turn the hot water tap on, and have hot water. When I live off-grid, pretty much every time you had to boil the hot portion of your hot water for bathing and for anything else, and then mix it with cold water, and then either lift it up to a gravity feed system or sit there and pour it on yourself using a ladle or a pitcher. So showering takes multiple times longer than it does in a grid home, unless you really have your system set up properly. Laundry, cooking, everything takes considerably longer. And so you just have less time to do less things in a day. And that's really the difference between a modern lifestyle and an 1800s lifestyle. You can get up in the morning and think, I'll have my food done by this time, I'll have bathed by this time, I'll be out the door by this time, and I'll be able to run around and get all these things done. And you're able to accommodate that by using money, basically, by having a job where you are specialized in something and get paid enough to pay your way through the inconveniences or challenges that would otherwise get in your way. But in a lot of grid down or off grid style living, you don't necessarily have the luxury of doing all those things. And it takes a different style of thinking. It just takes a different lifestyle altogether. And you really start to realize the things that you don't necessarily need, because you start looking for things to sort of trim off of your schedule and out of your lifestyle. So whether or not that's a goal for you, or whether or not it's really something that you worry about, I do think that it's a decent standard to hold your lifestyle and your preps up against, because I think you'll really start to realize have some of the unnecessary complexities in your life, and maybe get an appreciation for the simple life, which is really the only life that you can live when you're living off grid, unless you're putting a lot of money and resources into it for setup. Most off grid lifestyles are a very simple, work intensive life. It's very rewarding, but again, it's really not something for everybody. But I think that if you're concerned about prepping, living sustainably, being ready for a lot of situations, I think that asking yourself if you could go and live off grid for a while with your whole family or whomever you plan on being in a prepper group with, I think asking yourself that is a very valuable question, and will get you thinking about your preps a little bit differently. And yeah, and I don't think that anybody is very ready until they've really been trying to do it for a while. There's really no other way to find all the challenges that are going to come up, because they just, sometimes it takes months for you to need something that you didn't realize you need every few months, and you didn't realize would be a challenge to provide in an off-grid situation. So until you've lived that way long enough to encounter all the random challenges that will come up, you really can't appreciate what it will take. You really can't be confident that something else won't come up that you need the grid for, basically. Well, that's not a bad population density equation there, Ryan. A tree fort. Yeah, family's definitely going to be one of the main problems, and it's something that I want to talk about. Ties into leadership and Nice. That sounds fun. I don't know that I could handle the low water. I like having a lot of water around me, but sounds fun. Sounds like I could probably go check out that 20,000 acres. Don't come up here. You probably have a hard time leaving. Most people do. But anyway, that was most of my thoughts. I would love to end up living off grid again. It is the plan, it is the goal, or at least to be living on property and have it being geared towards sustainable living. Going straight for off grid is quite difficult. And there are a lot of things that a person can do to be insulated, to be hardened in their lifestyle without going straight for trying to disconnect from grid power and sewage and things like that. You can have your home and start to set up systems and facilities that will be very valuable and useful in a grid down situation without investing the large amounts of money that it takes to set up a modern convenience home that is off grid. And that is another difference between living off grid in a sustainable grid down fashion and living off grid in a modern off grid style. I would purchase a lot of things before I would purchase a solar power system sufficient enough to power my current modern home needs. I would much rather just continue to purchase cheap grid electricity and spend the money that I would invest setting up enough solar panels to provide my current electric needs when I could get things that would provide just enough for my grid down needs, and then spend the rest of that money in other extremely useful grid down facilities and systems. While it would be nice to have enough solar energy generation things in grid down to produce enough electricity for the way that my family uses electricity now, I would be spending a lot of money to set it up that way. We will not be using that much electricity in a grid down situation. And so spending that much money on that would be a little inefficient right now. I'd rather get wood gasification set up, which is more or less useless right now, but in a grid down situation becomes really useful. So another thing to think of is that we do have the opportunity to experiment with some of those things and set them up now, and not just be trying to play at living off grid. Definitely, Anna. And that's sort of what I was just getting at is I've done I'm just going to walk into the woods and start living off grid and start from scratch, go bottom up. And that's just how it has to be for a lot of people, because to set yourself up to have a sustainable off grid home, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's like purchasing an expensive home. So it tends to be sort of a go break the ground and do it from the ground up kind of thing. And that's where it gets really difficult. But it's starting to become a lot more popular to start to provide your home with sustainable options, like a way to provide electricity to your home, a way to provide just enough hot water, a way to provide just enough heat, just enough of the modern conveniences to not be thrown completely into the dark ages again, but not necessarily enough to make yourself be living off grid nowadays. It's very difficult to provide yourself with a modern lifestyle off grid, but not too hard to provide yourself with just enough things to make a sudden off grid switch not just a horrible catastrophe for yourself. Just rubbing his head in the dirt. Yeah, Prescott. Little land can go a long way. I've had access to that a couple times and been building on it with something like what you talk about, but it's it can also be very difficult, and it can be taken away very easily depending on the situation. Yeah, and a while back during a sort of ice storm temperature plunge here during the winter, I did a video about just how deadly the cold will be without modern heat sources. In my current home, we live just off of electric heat. I mean, we've got a gas stovetop, so I guess in a real pinch, we could just turn on the stovetop and hope, that we have enough ventilation set up to capture the heat and let the fumes out. But it really got me thinking that I do need, even though we're in a rental, I need to get a wood stove down here from the family property or purchase another one and get it set up here so that I could put in wood heat if the grid went down. Now I've got propane and heaters and stuff like that, but it's not sustainable enough. What I would really like is to get at least a wood stove and enough wood to allow us to not have frigid winter temperatures in my house if the grid does go down for a while. Because, yeah, that will be one of the first sticking points for a lot of people, and it already is. I mean, when the power goes out during the winter in cold places, old people die. They just are not able to take care of themselves or do much about it once it happens. And once they get past a certain point, it's a point of no return kind of thing. So it's already a reality. Oh, wow, -degrees. Yeah. I've lived in a metal camper trailer, like the kind that you pull behind a truck and it's just sheet metal. I lived in one of those on family property for a while. And yeah, it was not insulated at all at that point. It was so old that everything was just brittle and falling apart in the walls. And that was here in North Idaho, so it was zero temperatures sometimes. Yeah, moisture's tough on them. This one, I mean, the windows were cracked and missing some of the slivers of glass. It really was just like, well, you can stay in. I just moved up here and sort of plopped myself in the lap of family, and that was where they could put me up. So I wrapped the whole thing in tarps and insulation panels and stuff. But even then, I ended up having to cut the thing in half by hanging blankets and other things to make a sort of wall inside the camper and heating only part of it. So in part of my home, water froze and other things froze, things with salt in them, drinks froze. And then that was where I changed. That was where I did a lot of stuff before I went into the main house where, I spent most of my time. But, I've lived in what most modern people would call sort of tough conditions. I more or less slept in a sleeping bag, so I didn't have the electric heater running constantly. And, those sort of sparse conditions were part of what drove me to build my mini home to replace that camping trailer. I don't mind the cold weather so much, Ryan. I mean, definitely my Boy Scout upbringing conditioned me against it, and I don't have any physical problems that make it a problem for me, really. I spent a lot of time sleeping in the snow, so I would much rather the cold because my body will acclimate to it, and you can always put more gear on and stuff. Whereas I don't acclimate to extreme heat nearly as well, and I feel like you can't do nearly as much about it. But yeah, I don't know that I would ever let myself end up in a camper trailer like that without doing major renovations. And that's what, like I said, what got me building my mini home, which yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I could do the heat. I mean, I can do plenty of heat. I've worked in over 100 degrees running a gas powered rototiller that put it at about 120. So I can do it, but I do prefer to live in an area like this where predominantly it's colder rather than hot. We don't go. We might hit 100 2 days out of the year, and that's it. And that's really high. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the extreme cold. I don't like having to go to extra lengths to combat it, but at the same time, I've worked in it. I mean, I've just worked right in the snow constantly, year round. Not year round, but I've worked outside year round, and it doesn't slow down when it's snowing. You just walk through snow. You kneel down in snow and stuff like that. So nowadays, now that I'm not working physical labor right out in it and with no option to get out of the elements, I can handle commuting in it and just being in it whenever I'm not working. Oh, she loves the cold. Okay. Yeah, see, I like the cold. Just cannot do the heat. I mean, I can, but not to the degree that. Oh, you didn't miss much, Anna. You were only gone for about a minute. Um, yeah, like I said, I can handle the cold, and I can handle the heat, but not nearly to the degree that I can handle cold. Oh yes, I told the truth. I'm so sure. A very rude one too. You can go back and rewatch the whole show so that you catch it. I just feel that your body can acclimate to the cold much more readily than it can to the heat. And you can put more clothes on. And as I've said before, there's only so many clothes you can take off before somebody has a problem with it. And even then, running around bare naked in the sun in a sweltering hot day really isn't a good option. Your son's Tuesday running around bare naked in the sun. That's the joy of being a little kid. I mean, I don't try to do it, but I'm pretty sure if I did, I'd end up on a list and in a jail cell at least for a day or so. Anyways, I think I might get it going. I'm going to probably hit the sack and get up somewhat early and get to moving on things. There's always something to do around here. I'm literally always behind on things lately, so they won't take their shirts off even when, except when swimming. I was going to say even when swimming, that's a little odd, but I've been a little shirt shy in the past before. It really depends on the boy and the age and whatever. But yeah, I've always been a little bit shy like that, I guess. Some people are not shy at all as kids. Anyways, thanks to you two for dropping in and chatting. Nice of you to hang out. A good little live stream chat here. Anyways, I hope you guys are doing well. Hope you have a good night and manage to catch some Z's somewhere. Anyways, Ryan and Anna, you guys have a good night, and I hope to catch you on the other side of this sometime. Good talking to you guys. Thanks, Anna. I'm sure we'll be touching on it again. My new friends, Living the Dream Homestead, as well as a lot of people that I'll be meeting here in a few days at the North Idaho YouTuber prepper homesteader meetup thing. They're all doing that kind of stuff. So I'm thinking we're going to be talking about off-grid sustainable living quite a bit. Anyways, yep, I'm glad you caught me too. Always happy to talk to you. Been meaning to email you. Is your filter clogged up? I'm willing to bet that your filter has clogged and you've been too polite to mention it to me. Oh, well, don't feel it's necessary. That's a lot to catch up on, but sorry you can't sleep. All right, Anna. Well, I won't say anything either. Well, we'll see about that. All right. Well, you have a good night, Anna. I hope you're doing well and hope you can catch some sleep before you run out of time for that. Anyways, good talking to you. I've been planning to email you, so keep your eye out for that. All right. Good night. Rest well. Catch you later and stay safe. All right. Well, thanks for dropping in. I'm going to head on out. Hope everybody who's watching this is doing well. Stay safe out there.